questions?
I had a question about other realms that are mentioned in the Avatamsaka Sutra. So often the afflictions
The
and
flower
suffering,
ornament scripture. Let me just show
yes.
it to folks so people are oriented. Our precious flower ornament scripture, basically the most comprehensive and descriptive and useful sutra in the Buddhist canon. And it also is designed to be psychoactive. And so if you chant it aloud or read it aloud, or if you just read it, it literally changes your mind. It evolves your mind more towards the direction of the Buddha. And so it can't be recommended highly enough. It's not for the impatient, but if you read 20 minutes a day, you're done in 4 months. And can't be recommended highly enough. Okay, that's the introduction to the
So in the
sutra.
Avatam, in this sutra, and I've read of this in other Buddhist texts, some of the afflictions or suffering that sentient beings go through is described as animal realms or ghost realms or the underworld. These are three different terms that are used, and they seem to be separated out as if they're descriptively different kinds of hells. And I was wondering what each of them referred to because I haven't seen a good description of them.
Well, let's take them in turn. In the animal realms, uh, a self would be subjected to the animality of nature, where there's viciousness. The what do they call it? The viciousness of tooth and claw. There's hunger and greed and violence and savagery, and it's just animality, right? You're just an animal, and all of the higher functions of the civilized ego are in abeyance. I mean, they're not active, and you live as an animal. And in ancient Buddhism, there's both the reincarnation and the bardos, which maybe not so ancient. That's probably only about, I don't know, 12 centuries old. But these would be realms where your animal instincts are prominent and to the full, and prominent, and and you have to live like that. So you don't want to end up in an animal realm. In the ghost realm, you have things like I'll just use hungry ghosts as an example. And I'm just going from my experience of primarily Tibetan Buddhism, but also this Huayan Buddhism, which is not spelled like Hawaiian. It's spelled Huyaan. Huayan Buddhism. It's root Buddhism. Uh, are one of the major roots of Mahayana, and then Vajrayana Buddhism and Tantrayana. So in the ghost realms, using the hungry ghost as an example, this is if you die and you go to a place, a hell, where you have this tiny skinny little neck, this big huge belly, and you're constantly trying you're hungry all the time because you're a hungry ghost, and this is the punishment or the natural consequence of living your life as a greedy person who ate too much, who was a glutton. And so, just like in Christianity, we have some advice about these cardinal sins. In Buddhism, they have the same thing. So the logical hell for a glutton would be to spend eternity with a tiny neck and a big belly that you keep trying to fill, but you can never fill it. So you're constantly hungry. And then what was the third? What was the third?
I've heard underworld used, or maybe netherworld sometimes.
All right, so it's just the world of where underneath. It's not the Buddha land. It's not the pure land. It's not the land of bliss and beauty and love and peace. But it's the underworld, the dark world of chronic dissatisfaction, fear, disease, anger, revenge, all the baser, animalistic or ghost-like impulses are devouring you. You know, and you live like that for, well, as long as you're in the bardo. The bardo being the cyclical heaven of the, in this case, the Tibetan Buddhists. And I recommend, I don't know if I can recommend him entirely, but there was a book written, if you don't read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which we don't have great translations of, but we have a decent version of for you know, people who just want to get conversant with it lightly. And it was Sogyal Rinpoche, Sogyal. But unfortunately, he may have gotten into some trouble later with some animal realm impulses of his own, like lust. And in the West, at least, his reputation has diminished because of some sexual misconduct. But he was a decent writer and a decent guy, at least way back in the day. And so his book, called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, might be a good place to get familiar with these constructs. Sogyal Rinpoche, Sogyal, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I don't have a copy right here handy. Okay.
Thank you. One second. I gotta turn off this fan.
So every religion has a mystical core, a mystical truth, and almost invariably they're founded by mystics, by people who have had very profound mystical experiences, without exception, I would say. And so that's no less true in Buddhism than in the Abrahamic religions. The prophets in the Abrahamic religions were almost defined by their mystical experiences. Okay. You back?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
So you just mentioned reincarnation with regard to the animal realms, and I've heard you speak about reincarnation a few times before, and each time you've mentioned that reincarnation requires time.
Right.
And I was hoping you could explain what you mean by that, because logically thinking through it, reincarnation makes a lot of sense to me. But I'd like to hear what you mean by reincarnation requires time.
Religions that have, and they invariably do have moral dimensions to them, typically frame some kind of consequence for bad behavior or failure to step up to your spiritual responsibilities or taking responsibilities for your own soul or your own spirit. And so in the West, in the Abrahamic traditions, there's something like heaven and hell, right? For heaven for people who walked in light, and hell for people who turned their back on God or the way or on light. Now, in Eastern traditions, a very popular notion, at least in Buddhism and Hinduism, mainly Hinduism, is the notion of reincarnation. Whereas if you live your life like an animal, and treated other people like an animal would treat, I think these people were very insulting to animals, in my opinion. But at any rate, they didn't know humans as well as we do. They didn't have all the mass communication. So at any rate, so if you live like an animal, you'd be reincarnated as an animal or an insect or a snake or a lizard or a fish, as opposed to getting the full human reincarnation. And you could see how that could be useful in potentially motivating people, but unfortunately, sometimes it had the reverse effect, whereas people would just say, "Well, I may have screwed up this life, but next life I'll have a better chance." And so they keep putting off doing the work that needs to be done by the human while they're on this planet. And so, but putting all that aside, when we look at, as strange as it sounds, when we look at space and time, both appear to be emergent to our current scientists, right? And science is the pursuit of truth also, and so we don't just throw science out and adopt some kind of religious dogma. That would not make any sense. And we don't throw out religious dogma or religious or mystical understandings and just adopt science. But in this case, they converge, as so often they do over time. And the notion that time and space are emergent, in other words, are not fundamental, that they're created by the mind, and when physicists look for time, they can't find it. There's only now. There's only the present. We can't find the past anywhere, and we can't find the future anywhere. And so that's one clue. But then when you start using quantum mechanics and even relativity, I mean, with Einstein's relativity, we know that what we call a particular period of time could be seen as monstrously big or monstrously small, depending on our frame of reference. So we know that time is relative. I'm sorry, in this case, space is relative. But time is the amount of this substance that it takes to go across a certain amount of space at a certain velocity. So at any rate, the whole thing just starts to fall apart with modern sensibilities about time and space. And although space has been pretty much rejected as a fundamental by our contemporary physicists and other scientists, time is also reaching the same fate. So now, if there's not time, how do we formulate reincarnation? Well, you really can't. So everything that exists now in the eternal present. The notion of the future and the past, as hard as it is for our minds to grok this, is imaginary. All our thoughts of the future are just our thoughts in the present. All our memories of the past are just thoughts in the present. And so we live in this eternal present, this eternal now, and that's the reality. And so it's hard from that vantage to fit reincarnation into that. Questions?
All of that makes sense. But I guess my question is more fine-tuned to what happens after the death of the physical body. What I'm saying, okay, reincarnation makes sense.
Stay there, but I want to add one last thing, and that is that
oh, yeah.
I've had the great blessing of having spent some time with the Dalai Lama and watched him over time, and how he talks about reincarnation in person, up close and personal. And he used to go somewhat back and forth, right? It's understandable. He's the head of the Buddhist world. He's a reincarnation. He's thought to be the reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist of the Buddha of compassion. But sometimes he says yeah, sometimes he says no, and then you can't just easily deny church doctrine, if you're the head of the church, without creating all kinds of ripples. But then the most recent thing is that he's saying that he will not be reincarnated, because if he is reincarnated, it's likely to be somebody that the Chinese Communist Party has selected, and that would be the end of his tradition. And so we're watching what may be the end of a beautiful, beautiful shamanic Buddhist tradition in Tibet and Nepal and elsewhere. This Vajrayana, and the whole beauty in every regard of Tibetan Buddhism may be coming to an end because of political problems. So I think we need to factor that in too. Even the Dalai Lama, who's like the Buddhist authority, or close to it, has his real. I think he stated categorically he's not going to be reincarnated. So, all right, now you were talking about after death or something.
Yeah. Well,
reformulate the question.
So, if I think of reincarnation as the state of affairs after this physical body dies. It makes sense that there would be another state of affairs just because, well, from what I understand, heaven and earth have been around, earth being this world, heaven being the container in which this world appears.
Well, that's an interesting idea.
If this world
Wait a minute,
comes to
let's
an
work
end,
at this. So that heaven is a container in which this world appears. That's an interesting thought. Tell me more about that.
well, so to me, from what I can see, Earth seems to be this world, and all of its and all of the ways that I see the word Earth used conventionally, either in Taoist terminology or Buddhist terminology, or in Christian terminology.
Does that
honestly.
include the moon? Does that include the moon?
I don't see what. I would include the moon.
Okay. Would you include the solar system?
Yeah.
Would you include the our galaxy?
Yeah.
Would you include the universe?
The observable universe, yeah.
What about the unobservable universe?
Well, the observable universe is expanding, so every time it keeps getting added. Anything that gets added in to the realm of
how fast is it
sensation
expanding?
and
How fast is
perception.
it expanding? Do you know offhand?
Supposedly at the rate of the speed of light, or perhaps just a hair faster, I think, or a
Faster
little
than the
bit
speed of
faster.
light. So there's no possibility of us ever seeing this part of the universe in our current formulations, right?
Yeah, like with one of our telescopes, no.
Okay. And so that's what you mean by the container? Is the universe?
Yeah, the container would be space-time, basically.
But we just got through articulating how space-time is a mental construct. It's like an idea, like democracy. It's an emergent idea.
Yeah, I don't have a good word for it. It would be like
Or gravity might be better. We used to think gravity was a force. Now we realize it's a curve in what we call space-time. But then we realize that we're only talking about 3 dimensions. And the whole model starts to fall apart. The project has fallen apart. But go ahead. So this universe that you're envisioning, which is very, very
basically
big,
what
right?
I'm saying.
Very, very big.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically what I'm saying is if you're going to separate, which is there's a whole other issue of why would you separate. But if you're going to separate, it doesn't seem like anything that you see, touch, taste, feel would be heaven. All of that seems like it would be earth. Because it's what's the word for it?
And is
Earth
the sky
as an
earth? Is the
understanding.
sky earth too? I'm just trying to get a vision of what you're saying.
The clouds in the sky are earth. So basically, if you took all of the stuff that you can see, feel, or touch away, you wouldn't have space and you wouldn't have time. And whatever that is would be heaven.
The ether? Dark matter?
I guess maybe. I mean, what's not relative? How do I say this? Like, if I see a building, that's earth. If I see anything, that's earth.
Including a
If
rocket
I
ship.
touch, yeah. If I can see it, it's earth.
Okay.
Like if I can see it with these eyes, it would be earth
Okay.
in this formulation, because earth is from what I understand from the terminology that's used pretty consistently across spiritual traditions of heaven and earth. Earth is receptive, and it can't of its own change anything. So when I look at the world, anything that I see, any of
What
its
if you were
motion, any
blind?
of its
Anything you
energy.
heard, would that count? If you were
I
blind?
would count if you were blind and you hear something, that would be earth.
Okay. And what if you smell something
That would be earth.
or taste something
Earth.
or feel something?
Uh, Now this is weird. Earth, yeah, like if I feel an emotion, earth.
Okay. So now we're talking about feeling emotions. What about thoughts?
Earth. Like if it's a thought that pops in, like a verbal thought, earth.
Okay. What about nonverbal thoughts?
Like imagistic,
Whatever.
yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that if it can be apprehended by the senses, then it's earth.
That seems that seems accurate. Or at least that's where I'm at right now.
Okay, that's good. That's the whole process, right, of contemplation is like evolving thinking, and you have to work through these things.
Yeah.
What about something like
So
goodness? The abstract construct of goodness.
I don't even know what that is.
All right. Well, how about democracy? I'm just trying to. We're finding abstract categories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't think there is such a I don't think there is such a thing because it's so amorphous and it's different for each person. So democracy is just in my mind, would be a collection of the thoughts we just called Earth,
What about
depending on the time.
digital money?
That's the same as regular money. So it's kind of like democracy, which would be Earth.
So democracy is earth. Abstract concepts are earth.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Hmm. That's a good question. But I would think, yeah, because it's just made of thoughts
Okay. So
and
thoughts are
potential
earth.
interactions between. Yeah, thoughts seem like Earth.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to your original question. So now we have an idea what earth is or what you mean by earth. So now let's take a look.
So, if you were to die, the question is, my question was about reincarnation. Reincarnation seems to me to be when the state of affairs ends and then there's a new state of affairs. And so you could say that like every moment you're being reincarnated. But I would think with the death of the physical body, all of Earth that we just discussed would kind of go away in like a like a sleep state, and then there would be a new Earth, and then maybe you'd be a chicken or a human or another human being, and Earth
Okay.
would be there again.
There's a lot of Buddhists and Hindus that would agree with that formulation. I don't know how many, but quite a few. I mean, it's not at all, at least historically, it's a very common, it's as common or more common than the Christian or the Muslim ideas of going to heaven and existing in some other form for eternity with your loved ones.
Well, I don't know about the for eternity with your loved ones part, but
Neither do I, but
definitely the
what about in Greek Orthodox? Do you happen to know about Greek Orthodox Christianity?
Greek Orthodox has they have a heaven and hell
Okay.
dichotomy as well, and I think it's also delayed
And neither one
to
of those
death
would
of
be,
the physical body.
and neither one of those would be Earth, as you're describing Earth.
Well, hell would be Earth,
Oh, it would be.
and well, I mean, if so, hell is just seems to be a poor state of affairs of suffering, which is earth.
So
Seems
after
like.
if the physical body dies, I mean, we know there's hell on earth for living humans, right? Whose
Yeah,
physical bodies appear to be alive or conscious, all that.
yeah.
But I thought you were referring to something that occurred after the death of the physical body.
Oh, so yeah, they have a which is similar to all Christian and similar to all Christian formulations. Supposedly, this is a life on earth. It's a preparation for Judgment Day. You die, and then you go to heaven or hell. Hell would be eternal damnation, and which I guess would be like the worst possible scenario of earth. And then heaven would be you're in a lovely celestial place for eternity.
And now, can you contrast that with the Eastern, the Hindu or the Theravadan Buddhist or Hinayana Buddhist? The Can you contrast those? The
Yeah,
Mahayanas.
so for their reincarnation formulations, from what I understand, based on the karma of this present life and the karma of your past lives. So good deeds, your development of consciousness, all of that you work on, you can, upon death, well, it depends on which level we're talking about. If you go to Mahayana, it's different. But if you talk about the conventional reincarnation, then it would be upon death, you you could then be reincarnated based on your built up karma, and you can end up as a hungry ghost for an eon or something, and then maybe, or you could end up as an animal, or you could end up as a human being who's with even more virtuous qualities, or you could end up as a Brahma god and live in a god realm for tens of thousands of eons. But that's also not great, because then you're just pleasuring yourself for tons of time, and then hopefully you end up getting back to human and you can become enlightened. And enlightened would be you build up your karma to the point where and your consciousness to the point where you break free of all of that samsara, which is birth and death and birth and death and reincarnations, and you enter, I guess you would call it bliss, but different than just the pleasurable states of the god realms.
And
Or
then,
freedom.
and if I might just add to that, and in highest yoga tantra or the Mahayana, I believe the whole thing, maybe even Theravada, the idea is that some people, some bodhisattvas, agree to be reborn as humans until all sentient beings are enlightened. Can you raise your eyes up on the screen just a bit? There we go, a little bit more. Maybe tilt your screen. There we go. Good, thank you. So
Yeah.
in that way of thinking, some folks, bodhisattvas, agree to, even though they don't have to, because they're enlightened, they come back to Earth as humans for the sake of sentient beings.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay, good. All
Yeah,
right,
that's why I separated that one out, because it's slightly different than the formula than what I just described.
okay, good. Okay, now what? What's the question?
Uh, the question, well, so both of those, whether it's the Christian formulation we just described or the one we described now, both of them are reincarnation,
Abrahamic, I
from
think.
what it seems like.
Abrahamic would be more
Yeah,
accurate.
that's a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, Abrahamic,
Abrahamic, which includes
reincarnate.
Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. But go ahead.
Yeah, so the Abrahamic formulations and the Buddhist or Hindu formulations both involve reincarnation. It's death of one body and then manifestation in a new world.
Okay, so reincarnation includes a new world.
That's what it seems like to me. A reincarnation would be like a new world.
Which, by the way, is
Yeah.
actually that's Pure Land Buddhism, where if you do everything right, you end up being born in a pure land of beautiful flowers and trees and skies and clouds and just beauty and peace.
Yeah.
That's Pure Land Buddhism. Okay, So we have different formulations, but just for the sake of discussion, we could talk about Western and Eastern, even though that's not
Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
correct. It's even less correct these
right.
days. Okay, so what's the
But
question?
sure. Um, so my question was initially about, oh yeah, what happens after death? Much of these traditions talk about what happens after death. In the Sufi tradition, there's four stages of the, it's not man of knowledge, of the Sufi,
Mm-hmm.
and the fourth one, which is the most complete stage,
Well, let's
the
get all
Sufi
four.
is
That sounds
respond.
really interesting. I've never really thought about that. Let's see. What are those four offhand?
I gotta pull.
The Sufi being the mystical element in Shia Islam, disavowed by many, but also very, very popular, much more popular than people in the West have any idea how common Sufism is, both historically and currently. And to some Muslims, it's anathema.
I'm finding it now.
While he's looking, let me just speak to the whoever just happens to be listening. So what we have here is a condensed and abbreviated version of mankind's attempt, a sizable chunk of mankind's attempt to understand, well, what are we doing here? How did we end up here? Where are we going? Where are we from? And I can't think of a culture that doesn't have some version of this. Even the cultures that we used to consider primitive have their own cosmologies of this. And so it's like a question that's almost built into humanity. Okay, go ahead.
Found it. Yep. So in Idries Shah's The Sufis,
Okay.
he writes thus: For the Sufi, there are four journeys.
Well, let me
The
just say a
first of
word. Let me just
these,
say a word about Idris Shah.
yep,
Idris Shah is an extraordinary man who translated priceless Sufi materials into English in the last century. And before that, we had no idea of what this Sufism thing was. We had some kind of strange versions of people's idea of what Rumi meant, for example, or there were certain people, Al-Ghazali and other Avicenna and these great Muslim minds. We had slight notions of it, but at least to this 20th century man, Idris Shah, the son of the British ambassador to Afghanistan, and himself from a long line of Sufis, translated in a series of about 20 books, absolutely priceless Sufi wisdom in a manner that's accessible to the English speaker, modern English speaker of the West. So that's an invaluable contribution to our common humanity. Okay, so go ahead. What does he say in the Sufis?
in the Sufis, Idris Shah writes of four journeys of the Sufi. The fourth of which is the one I referred to earlier.
Okay,
Um,
but let's get them all
and
four.
you'd like to, sure. So this will be a little bit of reading. It's one page.
Okay,
For
break
the
it up as
Sufi,
much as
there are,
possible, and maybe people can put on captions or whatever so they can understand it.
yeah, yeah. For the Sufi, there are four journeys. The first of these is the attainment of the condition known as fana, Fana, sometimes translated as annihilation. This is the stage of unification of the consciousness in which the Sufi is harmonized with objective reality. It is the production of this condition which is the objective of the dervish orders.
Okay, so that's Satori. Okay, good. Unification. That's one.
That's the first. Yeah, and
And
then
so
the dervish
annihilation,
orders
and so let's notice here, annihilation and unification are the same thing. So annihilation of the commanding self, annihilation of the conditioned ego, that's equivalent to unification, which is itself is pretty extraordinary to realize. But okay, now number 2.
There are 3 stages after this. Nefari, a great teacher of the 10th century, describes the 4 journeys in his Muwaqif, written in Egypt nearly 1,000 years ago. On to the second. After he has reached the stage of Fana, the Sufi passes into the second journey, in which he truly becomes the perfect man in capitals, capital P, capital M, perfect man, by the stabilization of his objective knowledge. This is the stage of Baqa, B-A-Q-A, permanency. He is not now a, quote, God-intoxicated man, end quote, but a teacher in his own right. He has the title of Kutub, Q-U-T-U-B, magnetic center, quote, point toward which all turn, end quote.
The magnetic pole of the age, okay.
That's the second journey.
Okay.
In the third journey, the teacher becomes a spiritual director to each kind of person in accordance with that person's individuality. The previous kind of teacher of the second journey is able to teach only within his own immediate culture or local religion. The third kind of teacher may appear to be many different things to different men. He is operating on many levels. He is not, quote, all things to all men, end quote, as part of a deliberate policy. He can, on the other hand, benefit everyone in accordance with that person's potentiality. The teacher of the second journey, in contrast, is able to work only with selected individuals.
So he could only work within a particular cultural sphere, right? And with people of a certain level of prior understanding. So what is the word they use for the third iteration? Is there a word?
There may be in Ghazali's Iya when he describes the stages with a walnut analogy, but right here there isn't one.
Okay. All right. And the fourth?
In the fourth and last journey, the perfect man guides others in their transition from what is generally considered to be physical death to a further stage of development, which is invisible to the ordinary person. For the dervish, therefore, the apparent break which takes place at conventional physical death does not exist. A continuous communication and interchange exists between him and the next form of life.
So read that last one again.
Yes, this is the fourth stage, or journey. In the fourth and last journey, the perfect man guides others in their transition from what is generally considered to be physical death to a further stage of development which is invisible to the ordinary person. For the dervish, therefore, the apparent break which takes place at conventional physical death does not exist. A continuous communication and interchange exists between him and the next form of life.
Okay. All right, so do you mind if I comment a little bit on these here real quick?
Please do.
So we have the state of Fana, which is unification, which is analogous to Satori, right? It's the first mystical step. And then we have a perfect man, but a perfect man within the context of a particular culture, a particular time, a particular epoch, a particular group of people who are able to hear what he's or she's teaching. Correct? Mm-hmm. And then we have a universal teacher, one who's able to teach the world. And then we have something else, which is difficult to describe because it involves a death that's not a death and a guide beyond two worlds. And before we get to how Jesus exemplifies all of these, right? What I'd like to do is just point out there's a Buddhist, and it's primarily Zen, but it's also, it's primarily Zen, but it's also in other formulations prior to and after Zen. There's a series of configurations. There's host is a representation of God, and then there's guest, which is a representation of the human being. These are just ways of speaking, ways of making these things smaller to where you can talk about them. And so there's several different states that could be distinguished between the relationship of the human being to God or to reality. The first of these would be the host within the guest. This is a man or woman who has God inside, or truth or reality inside them.
Well, I think it's guest within guest, right?
Oh, guest within guest. Thank you. Guest within guest.
You start there.
Okay, so describe that.
Guest within guest is, well, if guest is the human being, guest within
or
guest is
ego.
The human ego. It's the changing conditions of the human ego. One moment you're happy and sad, and the next moment you're whatever, and it's just changing.
Okay.
With no God, understanding of God.
Guest within guest. And what's the next one?
Host within guest.
Okay. You want to describe that for folks?
Host within guest is, I guess, an initial inspiration or an understanding of God. You have a little bit of space with it. It's usually when people find that space, quote, within in meditation, where you can,
or in prayer.
There's a bit of a detach.
When they feel that they have God or Jesus inside them.
Yeah, like a stillness within them.
Okay, they found the spirit within the changing landscape of the egoic self. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, the next phase
is guest within host,
okay.
where they acknowledge or realize God as the, I guess you could call it, container within which all experience takes place. So God is this ever greater omnipresent reality, but they still are a human being within that reality.
So can you see how that could correspond to Satori? Now, rather than having God within inside you, you are within inside God.
In the intense state of Satori, the human being kind of falls away, the guest a bit, but still, yeah, agreed. It's
the general developmental level. Satori is a state, but the stage of development, and this difference between states and stages is vital. Okay, and then the final, we have what?
Host within host.
Host within host. Okay, good. So we have these. We have 4 stages here in the Buddhist formulation. Right? Now, the reason this is interesting is because we have the identical formulation in the Abrahamic tradition, in this case, in these 4 stages of the Sufi. Does that make sense? Or how do they describe these really. 4? Okay, how do they describe these 4 stages? What title do they put on the top?
The first stage of the Sufi is Fana, which is annihilation.
Okay, so that corresponds to our second. That corresponds to our second Buddhist phase, which is host within guest. I mean,
our third. Yeah.
Third stage. Sorry, guest within host. Third stage.
Yes.
Annihilation.
Yes.
Satori.
Agreed.
All right. Union of the guest with the host. All right?
Yes.
And that corresponds to the first of these stages, which would be Fana. Okay, yes. then we go to the perfect man. Actually, you're right. They don't correspond directly, but they overlap significantly. So the perfect man who's able to teach within his tradition, within a single tradition, right? Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, whatever. Well, in this case, it's Islam, Sufism. And he's seen as the magnetic pole of the age.
Yes.
Well, what was the word for that?
Permanency.
Kutib. What was the
Two
word?
words. Baka. The stage is baka, which is permanency,
Okay.
but the Sufi has the title of kutub, magnetic center.
Okay. Kutub. So he's able to guide Muslims, mystical Muslims.
Yeah.
All right. So that's also guest within host, someone that's guided by God.
Yeah.
All right. Now we
But
get to
it's
these
much
two
more,
extra.
yeah.
Much more what?
I was going to say that seemed is much more advanced than the initial guest within host. So
Yes.
there's
Yes.
a range
There's a
within
gradation.
here. Yeah.
Gradation. And then we have the third one, which is the perfected man. And what was it called? The next stage for the.
There wasn't a word given, but it's a spiritual director to each kind of person in accordance with their individuality.
So he speaks to them in accordance with their understanding. And so you could see how this directly maps onto Jesus and to Buddha.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
especially onto Jesus. So not only does he have God within him, he is God. And as evidence of this godlike nature, God nature, he's able to teach, he can teach common people on the side of the river, speaking in parables. And he can speak in parables that have different levels of meaning. Treat your neighbor as yourself, or it's nearer than your jugular vein. These things say different things to people at their different levels of understanding. Okay, so he's inspired also. And he teaches across ages and across disciplines. Across
Cultures.
Cultures and traditions, right? And
Yes.
Jesus, I think, is the perfect example of that.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, and then we have the very nebulous thing here where they say that he guides, and this is according to whom? The 10th century Sufi? These 4 stages?
Well, so this is Idries Shah describing the stages, but I think he's borrowing from Nifari, which is a 10th century, Nifari's Muwakif, which was written in Egypt 1,000 years ago. Nifari is a 10th century teacher.
Okay, and so according to this 10th century teacher, women or men of this highest level of attainment, we'll just call it attainment, are able to act as guides from this world to the next.
Yes.
Like Jesus, for example.
I don't know much about Jesus doing that.
Well, I think in Catholic doctrine, the whole notion of the final unction is to bring Jesus to you. We shouldn't probably get into that kind of stuff. I don't know enough about it, and it's also a little squirrely, but in my opinion. But the notion is that if you have Jesus in your heart as you approach the gates of heaven, you're in much better shape than if you don't. Something along those lines.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Can we see now, disregarding the 10th century formulation of this particular Sufi, presumably a Sufi, can you see how these things map almost directly onto each other, even though they're a little bit, they just slice it a little bit differently?
Yes.
And so then host within host is God acting in the world. And if we were in the West, if we were to name a man who is host within host, that's God within God, that would be Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So now we have just a brief overview of both the Abrahamic and the let's call them Eastern formulations. Now let's go back to your questions. Good. It was good to review that Sufi stuff. And which book is that in, by the way?
It's helpful. This is the Sufis.
Okay, the Sufi. Oh, yeah, and the Sufis. Oh. It's around here somewhere. The Sufis is a wonderful book for the little bit intellectual and academically oriented. It's not an easy book. but it's written for the general public. And I strongly recommend it if you want to understand what the Sufis are, not what the American poets have realized will sell books, but what the Sufis really were about, and their monstrous contribution to science and to philosophy and to mathematics and to any reviving the ancient Greek. These guys were the center of civilization, and someday may be again. But so this book called The Sufis is a great introduction in English, and I highly recommend it. It's available on Amazon. It's a paperback about that thick, but you don't have to read it all at once. You can. It's fascinating how I apologize for having to read books now, but for those of you who can read and want to read, it's a highly recommended introductory book for the general population, and it includes some things about Arabic and the differences between the language and the uses of the language, and it includes little biographies of some of the more prominent Sufis. Highly recommended. The introduction is by Robert Graves, for those of you that are impressed by that kind of thing. Okay, good. I'm sorry. Let's put the Sufis in the... Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So now what's the question?
Well, I acknowledge this is difficult because it's the fourth and last and most advanced journey, but on the question of the physical death and going to the next form of life or a new world, two things. One, that seems like reincarnation, but reincarnation also, if reincarnation is a new world, you could say that you're entering a new world every time you leave your house and go outside, because all of your senses are completely changed. Everything you see, smell, touch, taste, feel.
You could argue that revamped. Every moment of the present is a new world. You could argue that.
Yeah, that would make sense too, because I mean, if you go to the moon and you call that, or I guess we don't call the moon a world, if you go to Uranus, and that's a new world, basically what's changing is your sight, sound, smells, like it's the same thing that happens when you walk outside.
Okay.
So this transition, maybe it's just not appreciable or appreciatable, I forget what the word is, by the human mind, but if the physical body dies and you go somewhere else, it seems like you go to a new world of all of the different possible senses, a new earth, basically.
Have you considered the possibility that you go back to the world that you came from?
That's what I mean by not appreciable by the mind, because to go back to that world isn't even a word you could use for it. In
Zen, they talk about your face before you were born. Show me your face before you were born. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. That's one way, but there's another way to look at it. Whereas this world is the dream world, and you wake up from the dream, and you're back home where you started. Right? And there's many beautiful Sufi tales that kind of point in this direction, but I think it might be more accurate to think not in terms of what happens when we leave the real world and we go to heaven, but what happened when we left heaven and we came to this world. Do you see the difference? And I'm not saying that one way or another is the right way. I mean, I could tell you the way that I think makes more sense, but it doesn't make sense for me to say, well, that's the way it is. I think you need to discover for yourself. But don't make the assumption, and it is an assumption, that you're in the real world right now.
No,
well, you are, but your mind is not. Your ego is not. Your I, and the it's with it, all of that. What we call the real world is actually the dream world, and waking up is waking up from that dream, even for a little while, That's all you need to do.
Yeah.
And that is the goal of every mystic tradition. I mean, Zen, and the reason that Zen is appealing is because it removes everything else. It's only one goal, and that's to wake up. That's Satori. And they sound very, very odd. And people laugh at it because it sounds so odd, but so does they laugh at the Tao Te Ching too. But even in Christian mysticism, as in Islamic mysticism, to the extent that the churches allow it, right? Because this is a major threat to temporal authority. But this goal of waking up is the one that's the first goal. And that comes, okay, this presumes the guest and guest. And it certainly involves, so far as I can tell, and anybody I've ever read can tell, or anybody I've ever spoke to, the host within the guest. But then the guest within host is the first step.
Yeah, agreed.
And
that
so
makes sense to me.
And that's more the question, I think. I think that's your real question. But I don't know. So think about it some more, and we'll discuss it some more. This is a really nice line of inquiry. I think it's been very useful, and I hope it's useful to folks who want a more comprehensive understanding of the human predicament and what we've been able to do as humans thus far. And not only that, it's a source of great comfort and great peace. And frankly, as the Buddhists say, it's an end to suffering. So it's really worthwhile. Recently, someone asked me whether we were evolving in intelligence. Well, intelligence is not a unitary thing, and intelligence in one domain does not necessarily accord with intelligence in another domain. For example, we're technologically very advanced, but our sense of beauty, our intelligence about beauty has deteriorated. I think people would acknowledge. Do you see what I'm saying? And so we don't have a unitary intelligence, and we're certainly falling behind in certain vital intelligences, and one of them at the moment is our spiritual intelligence. And that may be the only one that matters, frankly.
Agreed. Well, yeah, if you just even the word technology is limited if you're going to say technology is just the manipulation of hexadecimal or zeros and ones in code, or the manipulation of iron and rocket ships, because there's technology that we have nothing in the modern age that even comes close to some of the technology of these teachings. And it literally is a technology. It's
certainly
meticulously crafted.
The psychological technology, we've become much less sophisticated in psychology, to the point of it being ridiculous. And literally the farthest we've gotten, at least in the West, communally, is some kind of developmental psychology, which is just the most narrow aspect of the ego and cognitive development or emotional development, missing the forest for the developmental trees. And so I've heard the Zenists criticized because they don't pay attention to growing up. Well, the reason for that is, first of all, they can tell how grown up you are very quickly with one answer to one sentence. They can tell where you are. They were experts at this. And secondly, they didn't have these teachings for everybody. These are for people who had already grown up enough morally, ethically, communally, and in every other. I'm leaving out all these other dimensions of development. But you can be sure that the Zen folks and the Sufis were very carefully watching their students' level of overall development, not just their waking up potential. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
And
just to help for the psychology part, all of the technology we have there, to put it in the formulation, is basically guest within guest work.
Very good. Very well put. Bravo. Exactly. We hadn't even started on the most rudimentary elements of what it is to have truth motivate. I mean, truth with a capital T. Excellent. We're going to have to stop for today. Anything else before we stop?
these would be longer questions. Briefly, network of loci, could you just describe, this will be shorter. I've done it physically. I think I may have asked about this before, so forgive me. I've done it physically, like changing location, but for taking on the perspective of another person or like a culture, what do you do if, how is it not just making things up? Like if I say, all right,
okay,
now
what you can do is this.
this
This is
person on
an
the
easy
street.
way that's somewhat entertaining. Pick a movie, hopefully a decent movie, but it could even be anime, frankly, and decide consciously that you're going to take the vantage point of some arbitrary person in the movie, not necessarily the hero, and then go through the movie and look at it from their point of view, the whole thing. You'll see a different movie, right? And you'll exercise this empathic capacity that humans have, and imagine it's, and that's just the start, right? Then, as you interact with people, imagine that you're them, you are them, but imagine it from their point of view, and look at yourself through other people's eyes, or look at something else, or look at some other person through someone else's eyes, and start to look at the world. You aren't limited to your own two eyes and two ears. And you can develop this capacity for it's empathy, right? To see the world through the eyes of someone else. And then again, as in all things, set your intent, and then resolve to evolve. Resolve to evolve. I like that. Resolve to evolve in ding 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 ding. Resolve to evolve in your capacity for this. And it's like lifting weights. You know, if you go to the gym and you lift the weights, you're going to get stronger, right? And so it is with this capacity. Okay, sir? That's a brief version
Thank
of it.
you.
And we can get into more details. We'll talk later, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.